Today's podcast is brought to you by Kentucky Farm Bureau Insurance. You never know what tomorrow may bring. That's why it's important to get the right insurance coverage today. At Kentucky Farm Bureau, we deliver the protection and peace of mind your family deserves. In fact, we've been providing folks in the bluegrass with dependable service since 1943. To request a free quote, find your local KFB insurance agent at mykfbagent.com. Kentucky Farm Bureau, big on commitment. This is Kentucky Farm Bureau News, the podcast. I'm Tim Thornberry, editor of the KFB News Magazine. And today we are blessed to have Kentucky Storyteller in the studio with us, Mr. Byron Crawford.
Well, thank
Byron,
you.
Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for pinning that title on me.
Well, you know, if you cross, and I'm going to ask you this question in a minute. If you cross over into Lincoln County, I think it is your birth county, there are signs at every county line that says, home of Byron Crawford, Kentucky Storyteller.
I realize that. And you know, the first I knew of that, when someone sent a picture to me on my phone of the sign being put up. It had just been put up. Of course, at that stage of the game, it's too late to say take them down. It's one of those things where you really appreciate it, and then you think, I don't deserve this, and all that kind of thing.
Well, I beg to differ with you there, but every time I pass one, I want to pull over and do a selfie with it, but there's always so much traffic around on some of those roads, I'm afraid I'll get run over. And I love you to death, but I don't want to get run over because of you.
After I finally absorbed the shock and surprise that they had been put up, that the fiscal court had done that, and some of my old high school friends had a big role in that behind my back. I asked one of them if it would be possible to make a little parking area for a picnic ground and maybe put on the back of the sign, "You're now leaving the county where Byron was born."
How'd that go over so far?
That didn't go over well.
Byron, I'm going to ask you first, just to tell us a little bit about your life as Kentucky Storyteller. How did all this happen?
Well, of course, the storytelling part came about gradually over many, many years. I worked, as you know, for the Courier-Journal newspaper as the Kentucky columnist for right at 30 years. And before that, I had worked for WHAS TV and radio for another 6 years, doing essentially for most of that time stories about people all over Kentucky, interesting people, and telling stories that they had told me. So my storytelling is a credit to thousands, literally thousands of other people, most of them Kentuckians who had stories to share, who shared them with me, and I guess eventually it soaked in so much to my life and career that someone put the storytelling part on there. Well, of course, I write for Kentucky Living magazine now, the back page in retirement, and the little intro for me at the top says Kentucky Storyteller. So that was someone else's device. But I grew up in Lincoln County, as you know, and grew up on a family farm along Hanging Fork Creek, which runs into Dix River, which runs into Harrington Lake. And I pretty much had the run of, my family had owned 3 farms together that were part of my great-grandfather's property that had been divided. So I had the run of all that land, which wasn't a lot, but 200 and some acres maybe. And then the farms next to us were all friends, and so we just roamed and hunted and fished on each other's property. it wasn't the way it is now. And I grew up. I'm an only child, and that. But the non-silver spoon only child type thing.
I understand.
My parents were farm people. They'd both grown up during the Depression, both in large families. And we were just small farm people, family farm people, raised tobacco, milked a few cows, raised, hay, and had some livestock, and had sheep one time. And so I grew up that way in the tobacco patch. Did everything that everybody does when they're raising tobacco, pull plants. I remember when they were still burning tobacco beds.
Oh, yeah.
And one year I borrowed a mule from someone and plowed my tobacco. In FFA, I had a field of tobacco that I raised, just acre and 2/10 or something like that. And I borrowed a mule because I wanted to see how it felt to plow tobacco with a mule,
How did it feel?
And, well, I didn't borrow the mule the next year, let me put it that way. But I grew up roaming through the woods and the creeks and fishing and living pretty much outdoors. And for some reason at that time, parents didn't seem to worry about where you were so much during the day. And sometimes I'd stay out all day. I got a 410 gauge shotgun, 410 shotgun for my 12th birthday. And I was off to the races.
Yeah. Sounds like a very storied childhood to me.
I often wonder if I'd had a bunch of brothers and sisters. Now, I had a bunch of cousins, and I was around. There were a lot of kids around. But I often wondered if I'd had a bunch of brothers and sisters, if my imagination would have developed to the point that it did, that has kind of aided me, I feel, in writing, in my career.
Byron, that's sort of my next question. I would assume that all those memories that you gathered from childhood and being raised on the farm had a certain amount of influence on your profession as you got older.
They had a dramatic effect on me. I often tell people that my trips to the stockyards and the feed mills with my dad on just routine farm business, had a tremendous influence on my storytelling. I heard some of the great storytellers who were around that part of central Kentucky. And then my family members were good storytellers. My dad was good at that. My mother was a tremendous storyteller. And at that time, without video games and other distractions, children listened when we had company. You know what that means? When we had company. When we had company, children listened to the older people. They didn't run the show. So all of us, by that I mean whoever the children were who were there, pretty much took a back seat to what the adults were saying. We didn't butt in a lot of times, and that rubs off on you.
Do you remember the first story you ever wrote?
Oh, my goodness. I think I do. Of course, I had written stories. The first story I ever wrote was for WHAS-TV. Before that, I had written for radio news. I got into radio pretty much right out of high school. Even when I was in high school, I was into radio, and I was doing news first. And I don't remember those stories. They were routine stories like come in on the Associated Press wire.
Mm-hmm.
But when I wrote for, I don't remember exactly the first story I did for WHAS-TV, but it may have been a fella who believed that there was a buried treasure on top of a knob in Bullitt County. And I went up there with him. And that sort of kicked off my feature reporting for the TV station, which grew into a syndicated programs called Side Roads that I did over Tennessee and southern Ohio and Kentucky. And of course, I was already working in Indiana at that time, as well as across Kentucky. So that was the first story that I guess I did. Then the first story I did for the newspaper was about my uncle, and I can't remember anything about it except I told the story of when a sweat bee was on my hand and he touched it and it stung me, of course. I don't remember how I wove anything together around that story, but it was about my Uncle George. And, that when I went to the Courier-Journal, Frank Hartley was the regional editor, and I had never written a story for print, ever. Not in high school, anywhere. And Frank showed me the Kentucky page of the Courier-Journal, and he had marked off a place on it about the size of the top of a shoebox. And he said, "You see this place here?" He said, "Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday." They later changed it to Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday, but he said, 3 days a week, this is where you will fill with a story. And if you can't come up with anything, this will be blank.
No pressure.
No pressure. But at that time, and you'll like this, I knew of 1 month's worth of stories that I could do 3 days a week, But then that grew into about 30 years that I worked for the Courier doing that.
Okay, you got my curiosity up. Did you ever find the buried treasure?
I never found that treasure, no, but that also grew into other stories about buried treasures in Kentucky that I've had, good success with. I've never found one of them, but I suspect that someone had found them before I got there.
Maybe the stories were the treasure itself.
They were.
Yeah.
They were.
Yeah. Well, you've seen, obviously, probably every county in this state way more than once and visited people. I'm going to tell a story for a minute. Several years ago, you and I visited Casey County, and we were doing some photos, I think, for a book.
That's right.
And there was a house across the road from where we were, and you struck up a conversation with the fellow there, and I thought, well, he just knows everybody. And I found out later you had no clue who he was. But you talked to him like you had known him for years, and he did the same for you. I guess you found that a lot when you visited with people, didn't you?
I have. I don't know how to explain that except that I think I think you can relate to this too. I think if people read you long enough or they watch you on television long enough, they get a sense of identity with you, that they know you, even though maybe they've never met you. And I had an old fellow tell me one time, we were talking about earlier life on the farm in Kentucky, and he told me before I left, and he was another fellow like the one you just described that I just had run into somewhere. He said, well, I don't know if you've lived during this time we've talked about. I don't think you have, but you've sure been around somebody who did.
He got the message. It sounds like.
Well, I've heard it. I've listened to so many older Kentuckians tell about their experiences that I can identify. I could at that time. Now I am an old Kentuckian, but at that time I could identify with some of the stories they told about the old ways.
You know, through the years, I'm certain this is the way you felt. A lot of the folks that are later in life, they enjoy talking about the old days or sharing stories, and they've certainly got a lot to share. It's kind of I would assume you feel like an honor to sit with those folks over the years and hear all those stories.
I sure do. I have considered it an honor to be able to tell the stories that some of them told. And I tell young writers, reporters especially, feature writers, don't take this lightly when you write a feature story about somebody. Writing 3 or 4 times a week may be our job. It may be old hand stuff to us. But to that one person who's telling you a story about their life, something happened, something special that happened to them in their life, that may be one of the highlights of their life, to be able to share that with many other people, because not many people have time to listen anymore to anything. And there are a lot of folks out there who just would love to share some of their memories or some of their thoughts or wonderful episodes in their life with someone, and there's no one to listen.
You know, you use the terminology feature story. I know that I remember well your days of television. You don't see that type of thing much anymore. I know that having worked for various small town papers, there was still a taste of it for them, but you don't see a whole lot of that kind of thing. Is that just me hopeful that it would come back, or have you noticed the same thing?
No, I've noticed the same thing, and I think it's the fact that most of the commercial television stations now have concentrated their efforts on the big metro areas, so that there is no really space in their budget to go out in the state and search down those stories that are special, or they add a flavor to what they do to their broadcasts. When I went to work for the Courier-Journal, we had bureaus all the way from Paducah up to Pikeville, Hazard, all over the state. We had reporters living there and having offices there. And now those are all gone. The TV stations, pretty much all in Kentucky, had some reporter who was out. Well, we called my first show that I had was on the road, because we were a CBS affiliate, mm-hmm. and CBS gave us permission to use Charles Kuralt's On the Road title of his series, and he came and did promos for us, and we shared some stories. Sometimes he would pick up some stories about Kentuckians from something that I'd done, and but then when we syndicated it, we had to go to side roads, and we broadened it out. But it's immensely popular if you have time and the money to send somebody out there to do that. When I first started for the Courier-Journal, I had to find out where all the Greyhound bus stations were all over the state, because I had to get my film back to the paper on the bus. And if I was, in Bowling Green or Paducah, I had to find out where's the bus station from here. And I actually remember one Greyhound bus driver who came into Louisville, knew he had my film, and he actually, when he finished his bus route, he drove personally. He got in his car and drove my film over to the Courier-Journal and said, "Here, Byron Crawford sent this in."
That's amazing.
It was just, that was another time.
Mm-hmm. But I still see a lot of value in these stories, in these rural areas, and what they have to say, and sometimes there's a little history about them. There's still a lot of value in that, don't you think?
There is an immense amount of value in rural Kentucky, and I wish that things were different. I wish we had better coverage. That's why people like your stories so much, because you're out there stopping at the country stores and writing about things that happened to you. And it's just, it's really an overlooked resource, I think, that we're not doing more to focus on the people of rural Kentucky.
You've certainly got a rich background in media, but you're also, and a lot of people will agree with me on this, an accomplished author. You have a lot of books out there to your credit. Certainly, I'm going to give a shameless plug into the latest called The Back Page. What was the first book, and how did all that happen?
Well, first, let's go back to the word accomplished and make a definition of that. I don't know if that would fit. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but when you've written, I've written well over 5,000 stories, maybe closer to 6 in total in my time. And what do you do with those? Are they, I have a bunch of clippings at home, and I tried to keep them organized for a while, and then somebody says, do you have these stories? And you go through those, and you rifle through them. Pretty soon they're all, that story, they're all shuffled around. But the Courier-Journal saw the benefit, I think, in putting some of those stories into a book. And so the 4 books that I've written, yes, I've written them, but they're collections of stories that were individual stories that were put together, a compilation of what I've already done. And so it is with the Back Page book that Kentucky Living just published. Those stories in that book of 300 and some pages are basically all the stories that I've written over the last 13 years for Kentucky Living.
I'm sure you hear this a lot. Of course, the friends at Kentucky Living are just that, friends. They do a great publication, and we talk a lot, and there's a great relationship there. Do you get a lot of people saying, well, I got my magazine today, and I always turn to the back page first?
I get that a lot, and then a few times I've gotten someone complimenting me on the story, and it was your story.
I hope you took credit.
Because I did. I said thanks. Because the Farm Bureau magazine comes, and then Kentucky Living comes, and some people get them kind of confused.
They do.
And so all the good stuff that you write, I'm glad to take credit for it when people get us mixed up.
Just so you know, I've done the same. And I always say, well, thank you. You have been an incredible example for me. Not blowing smoke here by any means. And so Have you talked to other people that say, I learned a lot from you, you've been a mentor, you've inspired me to do something similar to what you do?
That's one of the benefits of age, Tim. Seems that the older I get, the more people, and I don't know, the more people say things like that to me, and I don't know if it's because I really have inspired them or because they see me shriveling up with age and they think, let's tell him something to make him feel better.
I don't believe that. Byron, you have had the opportunity to see this state in a way that most people don't. But I'd say there's been a lot of changes through the years.
Oh, my. I just, so many. And I got in the truck to come up here this morning, and there laid a road map in the seat beside me. I'm probably the only guy in Kentucky who still has a road map in his carrying it in his seat.
No, you're not.
Thank goodness. I thought I was the last one.
Just so you know.
But of course, my wife used the GPS, and I have GPS. But I tell you what, a lot of places that I went in this state, GPS wouldn't work.
Yeah.
I tried it with a photographer from the newspaper one time when we were working up in eastern Kentucky, and we got turned around and thought we never would get out after trying to use the GPS. But I have seen, the Greyhound bus story with the film, many changes that I've seen. I've seen changes in the day-to-day way we live life, and I've seen changes in the people. But that's just, I suppose, part of the natural change we can expect through the years. I think about my dad, who was born in 1909 and was already, he was in his 30s when I came along. And I think about the things that he saw or did not see, when he was young, that he was witnessing at the end of his life. Unbelievable. Because he rode a horse to school, and they had this is city school. They had a stable back there where you put your horse in the stable. I guess they had some horse feed there or something.
Wow.
Can you imagine that? And people in eastern Kentucky, I remember, well, not just eastern Kentucky, all over the state, would tell me about the first airplane they ever saw. And I remember one old woman told me, she said, I remember the first plane we ever saw. She said, and it lit right over there. Like it was a bird or something. Yeah. I've heard so many of those kinds of stories that I've kind of absorbed that as part of. Sometimes I wonder if I lived back then because I've heard so many of those stories, but of course I didn't. It's been a fascinating trip, and it's just the people that I've had the opportunity to interview, and many people I've missed interviewing, who should have been on the list for my interviews. I was talking not too many years ago with someone in Henderson County who had spoken with a fellow who lived in Henderson County who had been a kind of a right-hand person to Albert Einstein when Einstein was working at the University of Chicago and putting together the atomic bomb for the Manhattan Project. And, of course, that was being done in pieces all over the country. I wrote a story about the Gale Company in Frankfurt, the little company that made fishing reels. They were making part of a timing device for that Manhattan Project. Didn't know exactly what it was going to be used for. So I guess the Defense Department farmed out those piecemeal around the country. But this man who has been helping Einstein just as sort of a gopher, just helping him, said at the University of Chicago, he remembered walking after classes. He remembered walking into a physics classroom with Albert Einstein, and as soon as he said Einstein didn't laugh much, but when they walked into this classroom, Einstein looked up at the chalkboard and chuckled, and there was this physics equation on the chalkboard that filled the entire board. The one equation filled the entire chalkboard, and Einstein looked up at it as they walked in the classroom and chuckled, and he said, "What's funny?" And Einstein said he missed one in that subset up there.
As only Einstein probably could have done.
Those kinds of little things are the things that I liked so much about what I wrote. What I was about the interviews I did.
You used the word fascinating a while ago. To a certain extent, we still find this all fascinating, don't we?
It is, and in some ways, the older I get and the more I look back, the more fascinated I am with it. Sometimes when you're in the middle of it, you really don't realize what's going on because you're caught, you're swimming in the pool then. And it's only after you step out and you get to look back at where you've been that you're able to digest and appreciate it.
This is I said I wouldn't ask you any hard questions, but I'm going to ask you one hard question. Of all the stories you've done, all the people you've met, all the places you've been, is there any one single thing that always comes to mind first?
There are so many stories that overlap and blend into each other. There are so many that I remember snippets of that I liked. I remember riding in a wagon with an old man, and he had two sons, and they had some horses, and they had some farm wagons, and he dreamed of going to Hollywood and being in the movies. He just thought if I could get some of this team and my wagon out there and take my boys with me, we could be in a movie, And there are snippets of things like that come to me. And then one of the fellows who lives up the road from me in Shelby County was with me one day. We were on the way to see his doctor. I was giving him a ride. And I really like him. And I said, we've been friends here for a good while, and I really enjoy talking with you, but I don't know much about your background. I don't know where you were raised or anything. He said, well, I grew up around Benton, Kentucky, but I was born in Waverly, Tennessee. But he said, you won't see that on my birth certificate, because he's up in his 80s. He said, you won't see that on my birth certificate because on my birth certificate where it says place of birth and in parenthesis city or town, whoever filled it out just wrote town.
Well, that's what they asked for.
So there you go.
Do you ever wish for a simpler time? I know sometimes I do that. And for me, the simpler time is when I get into a piece that I'm writing, or even if it's more of a news kind of story, I try to go there. Do you ever sort of long for those good old days?
I grew up for the most of my years, and then after I was grown, thinking that I was just born too late, that I would rather have lived back in, I don't know, another era, back in the earlier era. I worked in radio at the end of the golden years in radio, if not the golden, then at least the silver. Mm-hmm. I was a disc jockey when I was young, as a kid. Got a job at the local radio station when I was in high school. And so And that sort of naturally, I've stumbled into everything that I've done. Honestly, I mean that. Everything has just been something I wanted to be. I wanted to be in forestry. I wanted to spend my life in the woods, and I haven't been able to do that. Although I've gotten out there quite a bit, but I went to a career day in high school when I was a sophomore at the local radio station, and they didn't have a whole long list of things you could do then. They had the radio station, the bank, the maybe fire department, something like that. I don't even think they had that. The girls went to beauticians' schools, things like that. So I went to the radio station because I like to listen to music and the radio, and they let us read the news on the air. Not on the air, but they put us in the studio like yours here. Mm-hmm. And after and of course I read the news the way I'd heard the people read it on radio and television. And the station manager said after we finished, he said, you did pretty well with that. You might think about doing that. He said, you can come out here and help around the station if you want to, and you might find that you want to work in this field. So I did. They didn't pay me anything, but I learned some stuff. And when the disc jockey went on vacation, I filled in for him, and I got offered a job at a bigger station 10 miles away. So I took that, and that set me on the path of working in broadcasting and radio and TV. I eventually moved into television. Worked in Cincinnati for 4 years at one of the big stations in Cincinnati, and but I was a newsman, and that's just the way it happened.
Isn't it amazing how those things happen? You start out with one thing and it builds to another, and you. I don't know if it's this way for you, but you end up somewhere where you never thought you would in the beginning.
That's exactly what happened to me. Exactly what happened to me. And everything, every day was a new page for me because I wasn't ready for any. For a while when I was working in Cincinnati, I did the CBS Radio had a thing called Worldwide Sports in the morning. Frank Gifford was hosting it at that time, for the most part. And I wound up, I sent them interviews with the Cincinnati Reds because I had and they would use a little 20-second soundbite of Johnny Bench or Pete Rose saying, well, it was high and inside, and I caught it and put it over the left field fence, something like that. Well, I would get those. I would go to the locker room, the Reds locker room, and get those. And in fact, I got so many of them, I got $25 for doing that. And Johnny Bench and Pete Rose cornered me one day in the locker room and said, hey, we found out you get $25 for sending these things to CBS Sports. They said, why do we not get anything? We're the ones you're interviewing,
So you're telling me you made Pete Rose and Johnny Bench mad at you?
They acted like they were, and of course, I was real young, and I took it, seriously. They were joking. They laughed out after it was over, but all of a sudden, coming from a tobacco field in Lincoln County, and just a scant few years later, you're doing those kinds of things. As you say, you ever wonder, you started out one place, wanting to be somewhere else, wanting to be a forester, and you wind up in the locker room of the Cincinnati Reds, interviewing the player of the game. You can't make it up, as they say.
Sounds like a little divine intervention there to me.
Well, you just wonder sometimes.
Yeah. One other question for you. I'm sure that through the years, people, especially people just getting started, beginning, have come up and say, what advice can you give me? If you had a young person just getting into the media field and they came to you and said, I know your career, I know what you've done, what advice would you give me?
Well, one thing that I would tell them is make sure that you have a sincere, genuine interest in people, that your interest goes beyond just getting the job done, getting some words to put down on the page. If you're not sincerely interested in people, and I mean that in the big picture. If you don't enjoy people, if you don't want to take time to talk with someone beyond just what you can get out of them, what you need for your quotes, I think you probably headed in the wrong direction. That's just a general. I tell my children, we had 4 children, and I told them all, I don't think you can do any better in preparation for life, your life work, than to be genuinely interested in people and let your imagination develop. They need a good imagination. People who are in this business need to have a curious nature about them, be interested in things, be interested in what they see along the highway. My old friend Ron Bland used to tell me, he said, I could put a person on a bus and send them to Knoxville, Tennessee. He said, some people you would do that to and ask them to write what they'd seen. And they'd say, well, we saw some houses, barns, fields, and cattle. And that'd be about it. He said, I could put you on a bus and send you to Knoxville, Tennessee, and ask you what you'd seen on the way, and you could write a book. I think what he was trying to say was that I am interested in what I see along the way. That's interested enough to ask, to want to write about it.
Well, sir, I can tell you this much. You have been a huge inspiration to me. I think I've read all 5,000 stories at some point or another. And
my apologies.
No. They're quite fascinating and have had quite an influence on what I do. And I tell people that a lot if they ask me if there's one thing, besides Walter Cronkite, that one person that may have inspired me the most, your name usually comes up. And
well, I certainly enjoy your work, and I enjoy taking credit for it when people confuse us.
Yes.
And I still am holding you to meeting me down there at the edge of Houstonville and going to that ice cream place.
Well, as soon as I know they're open, we are there. As soon as they're open for the season.
I'm really honored when people want to share stories with me. Mm-hmm. When they want to tell me when they call me or write me and say, I have a story about something that happened in my family I think that you would appreciate, I consider that a real honor.
Absolutely. Well, you've done
and I think you do too.
I do. And you've done a remarkable job at it over the years.
You.
So, our guest today has been Byron Crawford, Kentucky's Storyteller. It's been a real privilege to have you here, sir, and I thank you so much for it.
The honor's all mine, my friend.
Absolutely. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of Kentucky Farm Bureau News, the podcast, and we hope you listen to many more of these along the way.